Good evening and welcome to the Care in View, the only online weekly social care chat show, elevating, educating and celebrating all things social care. So before we begin tonight, just wanted to give a shout out to our sponsors. So we have Prosperwell, digital marketing, caring for brands that care for others. So Prosper is the leading marketing agency for social care. We've also got CBAT, Care Business Associate Training, founded by Paul Blaine. CBAT understand the sector. Paul is a care provider himself, and CBAT offer personalised training packages, both virtual and face-to-face. And last but not least, we've also got Attis Insurance Brokers, tailored care insurance to meet your business needs. You can find out more at www.thecaringview.co.uk. Head over to our YouTube, hit the bell, like and subscribe for us just so you're notified of all any upcoming shows and podcasts. So tonight we're discussing preparing for your next CQC inspection and how to manage enforcement action. I'm delighted to be joined tonight by Laura Shelton from HCR Law. Good evening, Laura. How are you?
Yeah, really well, Mark. Thank you so much for having me. Managed to get back in after a fire alarm in the office, so hopefully there won't be any more to interrupt our live recording, but if I disappear, you know what's happened.
No, definitely. Thank you very much. So for anybody that doesn't know you, Laura, are you able just to give us a quick introduction into who you are and who HCR Law are as well, please?
Sure, absolutely. So as you've introduced me, my name's Laura Shelton. I'm a partner at HCR Law in the healthcare regulatory team. The healthcare regulatory team recently joined HCR as a result of a merger with Redoubts, and many of you may know my face from there. So I've worked in healthcare regulation for coming up to 9 years, and we have joined HCR, which is a full service law firm. So in addition to being able to offer our regulatory expertise in relation to CQC matters, which is what we're talking about tonight, we're also able to refer you to our wider healthcare team for really any aspect that affects providers of health and social care on the legal front. So it's been a really, really exciting time for us and for the team. And from a regulatory perspective, and those that follow all of your posts, Mark, and just follow the news generally, with all of the news coming out of CQC at the moment and the changes to the inspection regime, it's a busy time for the regulatory team. So yeah, it's really good and really exciting to be here tonight to talk about it.
No, thank you very much. And you're absolutely right. There's a lot of changes happening within the CQC. I did a blog post this morning. I kind of went down a rabbit hole, and I think we obviously had the new single assessment framework, which we'll touch on tonight, but we've obviously had the chief exec's resignation. We don't kind of know what's going on. We've had the staff survey, which is a bit damning in terms of the leadership and the learning and development and bits and pieces. So it kind of seems a bit kind of old territory, but new territory to a degree on what might be coming down the line for social care. And obviously we've got the election as well.
Indeed. So there's so many things to throw into the mix, so many variables, and that's why, resources like this are all the more important for providers to try and keep up to date on all the changes insofar as they can and prepare the best that they can. Because I guess one of the things that we would say is, despite all of the outward changes and the management changes and the talk that's coming out in the single assessment framework itself, the actual law that underpins what the Care Quality Commission do hasn't changed, and the regulations haven't changed. And and that's the framework I work from as a solicitor, and hopefully that transfers through to providing some reassurance to providers that although the inspection framework has changed in the way that CQC are applying it, the actual law and the regulations that they are expected to provide in relation to care hasn't changed at all.
No, absolutely. I think that's a great reminder. So the last couple of weeks, Adam and I have been touching on the quality statements. We did a deep dive into the safe domain and into the effective domain. Before we dive into kind of managing the enforcement action, I thought we should start on kind of preparing for your next inspection. We get a lot of managers contact us about what can they do, how can they prepare. I think there's a lot of confusion around what those quality statements are, and hopefully we've started to break kind of that knowledge gap down. How often should a care provider be expected to be inspected under the new framework?
That's a really, really interesting and timely question, actually. And it's a question that I receive a lot, not just in relation to the single assessment framework, but in relation to providers who are stuck at the requires improvement rating. They want to know when CQC will be back under the new framework and when they will be reassessed. Because of course, prior to COVID, really, the provider handbook had detailed re-inspection timeframes in there, and they were based on your current rating so that you would have an idea of when CQC would be back. They disappeared from the provider handbook actually before the single assessment framework. It was when when CQC was in its transitional regulatory framework, which was after the emergency support framework, which was while the consultation was going on about the single assessment framework, which we now have. Those timeframes disappeared and they haven't come back as yet. But if anyone else gets the updates from the Care Quality Commission, the regular email circulars, and indeed follows their social media channels, or indeed my own, I've just posted about this tonight. CQC are actually seeking views from providers on the priorities they should put in place for when they ought to be re-inspected. I actually took a screenshot because I took the survey so that I could see what providers were going to be asked. And CQC, they're due to publish some more information on this in the summer. Now, I mean, we are in the summer now, just according to the weather, and we haven't seen anything yet. But what they are saying is they've set priorities. So for planned assessment, they'd be planning to prioritise very high risk or high risk services, those that are inadequate or requires improvement. And you know, that's a top question anytime I speak to care providers: when will RI services be re-inspected? Services where ratings are older than 5 years and newly registered services. Now that's for planned assessments. For responsive assessments, they are prioritising activity in response to information of concern, so whistleblowing, safeguarding, family reports, etc. Follow up on enforcement action, which will probably lead nicely into what we're talking about later. And also responding to data and insight alerts about information that indicates outstanding practice. And this is, again, something that providers under the old timeframes found tricky, because if you were a good service, quite often you wouldn't see CQC for a significant period of time. And if you wanted to move from good to outstanding, how did you get them back in? And they are saying that they'll prioritise data about that, which I can only assume will come through the portal and other areas, which I'm sure we'll touch on as well. So the short answer to that, Mark, is I don't know, because CQC haven't published yet, but they are consulting, they're asking providers' views, their priorities are placed in what seems to be the right direction. So I would urge providers and stakeholders with an interest to respond to that survey and provide any other priorities that they think are important. It does then go on the survey to ask how often you think services should be inspected, etc. So definitely worth feeding back on.
Thank you very much. And what I'll do is I'll find the link to that survey and I'll share that into the comments for those watching tonight. So you touched there on the portal, and I think it's not something we should avoid talking about. Obviously, there are still issues. We know that there are registered managers that have left organisations that are still written down as the manager of that service. We've got new managers and their new organisations can't register them. So the portal issues haven't gone away. In terms of staying up to date, you touched there on kind of their bulletins. How do you stay up to date, and what would your advice be for care providers? Because obviously there is a lot changing. Like you said about the survey, there's a lot of people. Adam touched on the survey last week, and there was a lot of people that didn't know about it. What are your top tips for staying kind of up to date in the kind of current times of change?
It is tricky to keep on top of all of the change. I would say for myself, one of the key sources obviously is the Care Quality Commission itself. It's a little bit tricky because these surveys come out and it's not really clear whether, well, I mean, from a legal perspective, I think it is pretty clear, but whether it's a formal consultation or not. Formal consultations used to come out in a formal channel through the website, but in any event, there are frequent bulletins that contain a mine of useful information about what is happening at CQC and the changes. They also publish some really helpful videos. I know that the scoring system under the single assessment framework is quite different to what we're used to, a lot more maths involved, and they've produced a video very recently on that, which is really useful. I would also say, in a shameless plug here, to follow ourselves on social media. You know, that's part of our core work, is keeping on top of all of these updates, writing timely articles, producing training, participating in opportunities like this, and following yourself, Mark, and you know, other influencers, I guess, on the social care stage. But there isn't any one single channel. But I guess the most reliable source should be the Care Quality Commission itself. So if you don't already subscribe to their updates and alerts, then I would strongly recommend that you do that.
No, thank you very much. And Tina's come in to just say about the WhatsApp channel that CQC also have, which is helpful for a quick catch up. And I think, again, that is something that they don't necessarily advertise widely as their WhatsApp channel, but definitely something to be part of. I will share a link to the WhatsApp. I have to do it after because I've got the link on my phone. But yeah, you can join, and I think it's a great way of staying up to date. And I think my only advice for people would be, you need to follow a wide range of their suite. So don't just rely on the bulletin. You need to subscribe to their YouTube channel. Make sure you follow their Facebook, because what I found is sometimes they'll put something on their YouTube, but it won't be like 1-2 weeks until they actually then put it in the bulletin, or the other way around. And there doesn't seem to be that synced kind of push out, I think.
There is also something that I forgot, which is a really good source of information, and it's something that we keep a close eye on, but it requires a bit more investment in terms of time, and that's watching CQC's board meetings and reading the papers that are made available. Now, their board meetings are on their YouTube, and that's a really useful source of information about CQC's priorities, that the issues they're experiencing, and commentary on things. And quite often it doesn't get translated into policy or action until a little bit further down the line. But if you want to know what's going on, that's also another good source that might not be necessarily everyone's first port of call.
No, thank you very much. So obviously CQC are out and about there. We know that they're still crossing the threshold for all service types at the moment. Have you heard of any of the kind of common compliance issues that are coming up at the moment?
It still really, really varies. I mean, over time, in the years that I've worked in the sector, you do definitely go through periods where there's real themes. So, for example, for a long time, compliance with the Mental Capacity Act was a real strong theme in inspection reports, and making sure that people were complying. Through time, we saw focus on issues related to right support, right care, right culture, registering the right support, and that type of service, and making sure that care was conducted in line with the policies that CQC would expect, and depending on the type of service, and questions would be asked about it. Then, of course, infection prevention and control was such a huge feature through the pandemic. Now, that's going to be assessed under its own quality statement now. So historic data and the way that CQC are presenting it is actually going to be removed from reports going forward, I believe, so that it's not misleading. But the short answer is there's not really specific themes coming out that I would say at the moment. It can vary from region to region and inspector to inspector as well. It tends to be, we're still seeing inspections taking place in response to either enforcement action, follow-up from enforcement action, in which case providers will have a heads up on what the themes are going to be. And in relation to complaints and whistleblowing, I think, and I don't know if this is because of the nature of the work that we do, but most of the inspection reports that I've had cause to look at recently, or enforcement action, has been those type of inspections rather than sort of routine type assessments. So yeah, a real variety still. I can't commit one way or the other to what the key themes are.
I quite often have a look at the inspection reports on their website, and I know, and I haven't looked for a couple of weeks, but last time I looked, one thing that was coming out was around recruitment, the number of people that hadn't had all the training. Yeah,
staffing is always a hot topic, staffing and recruitment and staff files, that type of thing.
So you spoke about enforcement action a minute ago, and I know we were going to discuss kind of preparing for your next inspection. I'm kind of going to jump around here, but what triggers a CQC enforcement action?
So there can be a number of triggers. Information that they've gathered through assessments and inspections, or notifications that providers have submitted themselves, safeguarding alerts, whistleblowing, coroner's reports, complaints from family members or the public, information from the public, information from commissioners, perhaps, areas of concern. There's a real mixed bag of triggers, but basically anything that they think could lead or could demonstrate a breach of the regulations that might warrant civil or criminal enforcement action.
And obviously with the new framework, there's a lot more emphasis on the feedback and utilising the feedback from the CQC's point of view. Are we seeing more enforcement action since that's begun, or still about the same?
I think it's tricky to say at the moment because we're still sort of in the early stages of the single assessment framework having been rolled out completely. I'd say that enforcement action certainly hasn't decreased. And what I have seen personally is there has been a lot more precursors to urgent action. And by that, I mean, so CQC has a wide suite of powers, and I don't propose to give a lecture on the law, but I've written plenty of articles which I can share about it, but there's different types of enforcement action. And if they think there's a real serious risk and they want to take action urgently, for example, to impose conditions, formal embargoes, and in some cases even cancel services, they can take urgent action under Section 31 of the Health and Social Care Act. But what CQC will often do prior to doing that is they'll issue what's called a letter of intent, and that's essentially giving the provider a heads up that they're considering this enforcement action and why, and offering them the opportunity to produce an action plan in a very short period of time to try and satisfy CQC that the urgent enforcement action is not necessary. And I have certainly seen a lot more of that, and it's a sort of typical CQC thing. It comes out at 5 p.m. on a Friday and they want an action plan by 9 o'clock on a Monday, and it's all hands to the pump to get things organised. So there has been more of that, and there have been more what I would class as low-level enforcement action, and by that I mean things like warning notices, and that's where the CQC think there has been a past breach of the regulation or a continuing breach, and they're essentially giving a warning about that. But warning notices are published, press releases are issued, they're usually mentioned in the inspection report. They usually come hand in hand with the inspection report as well, and it's really important for providers to respond to them, because if it's incorrect or even if it's not in the public interest for it to be published and the provider doesn't challenge it, that then goes on the record and it can lead to a sort of cascade of more serious enforcement action. I've acted for a number of providers who've decided for one reason or another not to respond to warning notices, even though, speaking to them now, they probably had some quite good things to say, but now they've found themselves in a situation where they've got a notice of proposal to cancel their registration, which is obviously much more serious, much more high stakes. And it includes information like, we gave you a warning notice, you did not respond, and that obviously can be looked upon quite negatively.
And in your experience, not responding, is that normally because the provider doesn't, or the owner doesn't know how to respond, or is that kind of, I'm just going to kind of bury it and hope that nothing happens with this, or a mixture of both? Or
it's a real mixture. I think some providers, and I can understand, and you know, I don't want to come on here and be overly negative. I think I always have to be careful because I'm quite clouded by the fact that people only tend to come to me if they're having problems with CQC. You know, I don't hear a lot of good news stories, but a number of providers are disillusioned with CQC's processes and procedures, particularly factual accuracy comments to inspection reports. And so, for example, one of the providers I'm thinking of when I gave that previous example who didn't respond to a warning notice, they sort of said, you know, we spent ages responding to the inspection report. They didn't take any of it into account. They didn't make any changes. They didn't even properly reply. They didn't give us proper feedback. Then we got the warning notices. We just didn't think there was any point. And they obviously at that point hadn't really thought about the consequences going forward. In other cases, I think providers do really hope that they can sort things out and that CQC will come back and re-inspect and give them a clean bill of health. And that is how the system is supposed to work. But in my experience, it's very rare, and I'd love to hear actually if anyone has different experiences of this, but it's very rare that I hear that a provider has received a warning notice and they have a deadline to comply within that notice, that CQC have then come back to re-inspect after that to see whether they've complied or not. Now, that is recorded as one of their priorities in this survey about when they will re-inspect. and it should be the way that the system works, as I've said, but I think due to a number of factors, not least resource, it's not how it works at the moment. So providers think they're doing all this good work to put it in place, but no one's come back out to check, no one's re-inspected. So in the meantime, their report has been published with reference to the warning notice because they haven't responded. You know, a press release has gone out about the warning notice, the local press has picked it up, and it's very difficult for providers to come back and counter that balance. So even if you don't want to instruct a lawyer to do it, I think there's very few circumstances where I think you wouldn't want to say something in response, even if, you know, and even if CQC have got some of it right and you have got areas to develop, good providers are constantly reevaluating and want to put forward that they're trying to make changes and continuously improve. So even in some circumstances you can say, and I've actually had some success with this on behalf of providers, yes, when you came out to inspect there was this issue, you've issued a warning notice however many weeks later. In the interim, we've done X, Y, and Z. And although we were possibly in breach, although I'd be careful about saying that, although we were not meeting the standards at that point, we have done things now so it's no longer in the public interest to publish this warning notice. And I have had warning notices very recently withdrawn and not published as a result of making submissions like that. So yeah, I think it's always important to think about responding.
No, thank you. And I was listening there around kind of the action plans and bits and pieces, and I'm going to ask you about them later. I just wanted to dive back into kind of the preparation of the next inspection. So what would your advice be on how a care provider can prepare for their next inspection? So hopefully they've got their head around the single inspection framework. Like you said earlier, actually the legislation, the law actually hasn't changed. It's just kind of what the CQC are looking for. But what would be your number one top tip on how to prepare?
I think there's two things that I would say I think are really important. First of all, get familiar with the quality statements and think about examples of how you can demonstrate, perhaps with case studies even, how you demonstrate that good practice in practice. But what I think is key, and you touched on it earlier actually, is the 6 evidence categories that sit under the quality statements and what CQC are going to look at. So we've got feedback from staff and leaders, feedback from partners, observation processes, outcomes, and people's experiences, which has always been at the heart of CQC's inspection framework. You know, at least 3 of those now, perhaps more depending on how you interpret it, relate to feedback. So as a provider, you want to be thinking really carefully about the way that you gather feedback from all stakeholders, not just your residents and your families, but, you know, commissioners, people you work with, external services. But it's not enough just to gather that feedback, just to send out a survey, tick a box to say that we've got it. You have to analyse it, reflect on it, and use that feedback. And I think what the new single assessment framework brings and the 6 evidence categories is a real renewed focus on feedback. And the best way that providers can prepare is to use that feedback to their advantage. So again, you know, translate that feedback into little case studies that you could present to CQC. I'd also, this is a third thing, I'm just gone off now, to prepare your staff, empower your staff. Everyone's going to be nervous at an inspection, even people that have been inspected multiple times, managers, consultants. I've actually attended inspections with clients in registration cases, and it is a stressful experience. Make sure to give the best version of themselves and the best version of the service, and whether that's investing in some external training or just working on your own, you know, your own culture about how you prepare for these things. You'll not be able to decide who CQC gets and comfortable knowing that whoever they speak to is going to give a really good account of themselves and your organisation.
No, absolutely, and obviously needing to take into account that not everybody feels comfortable, you know, talking to the CQC, talking to CQC inspectors. You spoke there around case studies, and I think from my own experience, I think they're a really beneficial tool. I think especially when you talk about the impact that it's had either to your team or the people you support, I think it really kind of drums home kind of that positive message that you're trying to get across to inspectors. And I think we live in a world full of data and digital, and actually sometimes those case studies bring to life what actually we all want to do, which is to provide high quality, good quality care. And actually I think the case studies allow you to do that. You spoke around kind of feedback and utilising feedback. What role does auditing play within an inspection and preparing for an inspection?
I mean, it's really essential. It's such a key governance tool, but again, it can't be a tick box exercise. Often providers will send me evidence as part of whether it be responding to inspections or inspection reports or enforcement action. Oh, but we've done an audit, we've done an audit, we've done an audit. Well, that's fine, but have you actually looked at the outcome of it? Have you made sure that there's been an action plan? Have you gone as far as making sure that's implemented and sustained? And I think that's the key. You know, it's a sort of short and sweet on audits. That's the key to that. But clearly, a well-led service will have a comprehensive suite of audits, but not an overly complicated one, actually. Because that can be a hostage to fortune in itself.
No, definitely. And I think the key is that actually you've got senior care workers. It might be a frontline care worker that you're getting to complete that audit, or somebody in your back office. And actually, I think if you make it too overcomplicated or too onerous, then actually your staff team then don't want to fill it out, and then actually that whole learning culture disappears because people actually put it off. Either it then doesn't get done, or people just whiz through it in the hope that actually it's just something off of their list.
Yeah, and making sure all of your senior management team or whoever may come to speak to CQC on the day are aware of where these audits are and how they work. You know, I've had a service in the past that's come a bit unstuck because the registered manager wasn't there on the day of the inspection for whatever reason, and other people within the team just didn't know where the audits were, really straightforward stuff like that. But it can be quite, it doesn't exactly scream well led when you see you're in and you can't find your suite of audits. But that would lead on to something that we might talk about later, and responding to inspection reports, responding post-inspection, and even enforcement action. If you're the manager that's come back to that service and heard, oh, I'm really sorry, but this is what's happened, pick up the phone, email your contact at CQC, send them the details, because you have some time between, sometimes it's quite a long time between the inspection and the report coming out. And if there are key things like that have been missed that were there on the day and you can rectify, then you should send them to CQC. Don't wait for them to send you a draft report that says, oh, they didn't have it.
No, absolutely. And one hopes that once the portal is up and running, actually that'll be the central point for all of that information. So hopefully you'll be able to, as the registered manager, feed everything in. So actually you haven't got to rely on your teams if you're not in the office, actually making sure that they've shown the inspector exactly what they need to see and to sell that positive story that you would sell yourself.
Yep, exactly.
So you spoke around the importance of upskilling your staff team, upskilling the registered manager, the business owner. What role does it do providers have in upskilling kind of families, the people they support in preparing for an inspection as well?
I think that's really important. Having a good relationship with family members and clear channels of communication. I don't know if I'd go so far as calling it upskilling staff members. So I just wanted to check. Everything broke up a little bit there. Hopefully you can still hear me.
Mine did as well. I don't know.
You can
still hear
you. Just going back on feedback, I think it's giving really good opportunities to your residents and family members to provide information to CQC. I would be, as a provider, if I was getting, compliments and cards and emails about how well we're doing as a service, I would be inviting my family members and residents to send that on to CQC, because that's something that they should be taking into account in planning their inspection priorities. It's difficult to sort of upskill in terms of specific inspections coming around, because more often than not they're unannounced, and with the frequencies, and we don't get the PIR anymore, which used to be a bit of a heads up that CQC was on its way within a certain period of time. So you wouldn't necessarily know when to have those conversations with family members. But I think having an idea of who your champions are in amongst your residents and family members. You may have regular resident meetings. You may even have family meetings, and you may have family groups. You may want to consider a list of people that wouldn't mind being contacted to come in. You'd obviously need to get their consent, but to come in and speak to CQC face to face. CQC will obviously ask for contact numbers now to be able to contact and gather feedback. And again, if you're sharing that kind of information, it's worth having a chat with your family members beforehand. On the other hand, there will be, and I can guarantee it in almost every service, there'll be family members and people that are perhaps not as happy with the service or have routine cause for complaint. And I think it's keeping on top of that as well and managing the risks to your service of disgruntled family members or complaints that haven't been resolved, going straight to CQC. So it's making sure you've got your own robust procedures in place to ensure that your complaints are dealt with as swiftly as possible and a really good record of that, because that's something else that CQC will be interested in when they're inspecting / assessing.
No, definitely. And I think we've spoken about it on the show before, actually making sure that all of those, even if you've got a relative or somebody that's living in your service that continuously complains, continuously has concerns, is to address each of those on an individual level and make sure that you investigate and respond accordingly, because you can bet your bottom dollar the one time you don't is the one time that they'll let the CQC know, and actually then your whole reputation just from...
Yeah, and even if we quite frequently will hear from providers when individuals have been identified in inspection reports or whatever, and they'll say, I mean, this person, this family, this whatever, they always complain, they're serial complainers, blah, blah, blah. But if there actually is a record of, loads and loads of complaints they've been dealt with, you can actually demonstrate to CQC that, they do have a bit of a propensity to complain, but that doesn't mean we don't take it seriously, we action it, etc., etc. So yeah, it's important to always keep on top of that.
No, thank you very much. I'm going to apologise for anybody that can hear the church bells. I'm conscious that everybody last week could hear them. Normally you can't, but they're exceptionally loud again this week. Tina has been in the comments when we were speaking about audits, and I'm not going to lie, I'm not going to attempt to pronounce that word, but she is recommending approaches can produce good evidence of care outcomes and not just traditional audits. Tina, if you've got any more examples of that, it'd be great to hear them. So
that's really interesting, because outcomes are, I mean, the sense in which CQC use outcomes is maybe different to what you might automatically think, but in terms of feedback and demonstrating how your service provides a good outcome, yes, there's different ways to do it out beyond the traditional. Then I think that's really interesting, and I'd love to hear more about that, because other things that CQC are looking for is innovation, and it sounds like that might be an example of that.
Yeah, so she has just come back. She's very quick with lived experience.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Thanks.
The CQC definitely want to hear about lived experience. And I think we definitely live in a culture post kind of pandemic where lived experience and the voice of those using care services shines a lot more than it ever did before, which is only a good thing. But yeah, no, definitely want to be making sure that their voices are heard throughout everything we do. So I want to move on to managing the enforcement action. So say we're a care provider, we've just had our inspection. What action should we be taking immediately after that inspection? Should we be doing anything? Should we be kind of dissecting what's just happened? Should we be notifying anybody?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think if we're talking about enforcement realms, we're thinking, I guess, of providers that have had an inspection and it's perhaps not gone as well as they would have hoped, or there's been some sort of an issue that they think enforcement action might be coming down the line. And I think one of the key things, well, the first thing is not to panic. And the second thing would be, if CQC have identified shortcomings in the inspection and given you that feedback about it, if you can address them, you should. And you should provide evidence of that to CQC as soon as you can. And if they've picked up things that are not quite correct, or they've misinterpreted something, and it just needs clarity, then again, you should supply that. Don't wait until you get your draft report and go through the factual accuracy process. There is a window, particularly post-inspection, and it may be that actually, because the assessment model has changed and it can continue on the review of papers, not when they're crossing the threshold, you do have that extra window of time to provide information. But then if that hasn't worked and you do receive a warning notice, a notice of proposal, an inspection report that you're not happy with, again, don't panic. There's always time to respond. There's always a way to respond one way or the other. Obviously, when it's urgent action, it's slightly different, but there are always steps that can be taken, and getting some good advice, from obviously I would say from a lawyer, a specialist lawyer like myself, but there are others out there, and or perhaps or a consultant. Sometimes an independent pair of eyes can be very reassuring to CQC, especially if you're having management issues or staffing issues. It may be that you want to get someone in to help steady the ship as well while you see through the enforcement action.
Thank you. And in terms of that factual accuracy, and I don't know whether this is impacting on social care, but I did see that the CQC released a statement for GPs in their bulletin that there's delays in getting reports out. And I kind of assume that actually if there's delays on that side, there's potential delays in social care. Should providers still be pushing on with making, I mean, obviously you won't have the report, but we're pushing on with trying to resolve maybe some of that feedback that CQC have given, or should they sit tight?
Yeah, I mean, if you know about it and it's within your gift to change and to perhaps influence the report, then absolutely. It doesn't preclude you from having, your 10 days to respond under the factual accuracy process. I mean, there are delays with GPs. It's hard to know whether there's delays in social care or not, because I've completely lost the thread of what the KPIs now for producing inspection reports actually are, but I know that they're unlikely to be being met. There can be quite a long period of time in inspection reports coming out, and memories fade, especially under pressure of inspection. If you've not taken really good notes, what was a pressing issue at the time and you had a really good handle on, perhaps by the time the inspection reports come out, you may have forgotten that, or staff may have moved on. So I think taking prompt action and supplying that to CQC gives you the best chance that the report in its draft form is going to be the best reflection of the inspection that it can be. And if it's not, it also gives you a ground to respond in the factual accuracy comments. If they're still getting it wrong, they still haven't looked at your evidence, that's a really robust challenge, and that's the type of challenge where you might also be looking to challenge the ratings.
No, thank you very much. So in terms of enforcement action, what are the legal implications? So I've never had enforcement action, so I'm looking forward to kind of this second half, and I've got a set of questions that I kind of have got to. But if anybody's got any questions, anybody watching live, please do pop them in the comments and we'll bring them up on screen and make sure we get them answered. But what are the legal implications of enforcement action being taken by the CQC?
Typical lawyer answer here, but it depends. But it depends on the type of enforcement action that's been taken. There's obviously the civil suite and the criminal suite. Criminal enforcement I probably will touch on less. It's more obvious, certain offences will lead to prosecution or fines, etc. And those are the consequences. In relation to civil enforcement action, warning notices, I would say, is the sort of lowest level, and that's a publication to the wider public that you have been or are in breach of regulation. As I say, press releases are issued about it. It goes into your inspection report. But breaches of regulation also affect ratings as well. And it can start a domino effect. So if you have warning notices that the CQC do not consider have been complied with, they may see that to be persistent breaches of regulation. If you're not already rated as inadequate, then it can lead to an inadequate rating. If the breaches are serious, if there are risks to service users, they may consider more serious enforcement action, and those would be perhaps some of the urgent powers. Now, in terms of legal implications, and again, this is a pretty high-level summary because it's all quite intricate under the the Health and Social Care Act, and it's why it is important to get advice if you do receive enforcement action. But broadly speaking, the Section 31 powers, if conditions of registration are imposed, they take effect immediately. And if you don't comply with them, then you could be committing an offence. So it's really, really important. And the types of conditions that we see more often than not are, first of all, a restriction on admissions. And sometimes it's also readmissions without CQC's consent. And that can be quite tricky for providers, where people have gone into hospital short term and perhaps can't come back to the service. And I have unfortunately seen CQC attempt to refuse that consent for providers to come back. For service users to come back. I digress. Other urgent conditions are reporting conditions, positive obligations to do something. So if they think that your infection control isn't up to scratch, that you would provide audits. Other ones I've seen recently where there's been staffing concerns, that a full review of all staff files is done within a certain period of time, reviewing care plans. But as I say, those urgent conditions are serious because they take effect immediately. And the way to challenge, well, there's a few ways to challenge them, but through the legal process is to appeal. Or you can get advice about subsequently down the line applying to have them removed. One interesting aspect of urgent conditions is depending on the way a provider's registration is set up. If a provider is registered and has services as a location condition, the CQC can actually use those urgent powers to cancel a whole location. They can seek to, remove that location condition. So they can be very, very serious, but they should only be exercised in the most serious of circumstances and in proportion to risk. Sort of jumped about the spectrum here from like the low level to the extremely high level. There's also powers to get in front of a magistrate to cancel, and we have dealt with cases like that here. In between, we have the sort of slow cancellation route, as we would call it, with a notice of proposal to propose to cancel your registration or propose to vary a condition to remove a location, which is in effect a cancellation. You get 28 days to respond to that. I think what's really, really, really important for providers to bear in mind and not lose hope, and that is that when CQC are making a decision about that enforcement action, they have to take into consideration the position as at the date they are considering the representations, not as at the date of the inspection. So you, at the very least, get that 28-day period to respond. Now, if you're able to satisfy CQC through your representations, perhaps they may also re-inspect. That may be the end of it, and they'll decide not to adopt the proposal. On the alternative, if CQC are still not happy, or perhaps they've not been back and re-inspected, which is the more common experience that we see, they'll issue what's called a notice of decision to cancel registration. Now that is the next level of enforcement, and it takes the case into the Care Standards Tribunal, and that's the way that you would seek to appeal. You get 28 days to appeal, and then CQC get a couple of weeks to respond to that. But the test is the same. It's a decision as at the day the tribunal are considering the representation. So again, you get that time to make changes. And during that time, we would obviously be working with providers on action plans, responding to detailed allegations, perhaps working with an independent consultant, changes in staffing, and all of our focus where it's possible would be on demonstrating that things have improved. Where things are tricky and where we have to be very strategic in the preparation of the evidence is where there is a catalogue of enforcement action that's perhaps not been responded to, like warning notices or even previous notices of proposal that haven't been adopted. So the regulatory history is something that CQC will take into account, but what should happen is that the main consideration should be the position as at the date of making the decision, weighed up with risk to service users, and any enforcement action that CQC should take must be proportionate, and if it's not, then that's capable of challenge.
No, thank you. And that date of consideration, so there's a number of managers in the manager forums that are talking about the inspections that they're currently having right now, but the inspectors have told them that actually it could take 2-3 months for that inspection process to be complete. So say the inspector day one finds an issue that could be something that would lead to enforcement action, but actually 2-3 months down the line, they're still going with the inspection, asking for more data. Where would that provider likely stand? Would that be down to the CQC to think actually in that 2-3 month window, you've actually resolved that? Would they still?
Yeah, I mean, it's far from ideal, but it's not unusual, and I've heard that, and it makes my job a lot easier in helping to respond to enforcement action. I mean, we even see some urgent action coming out weeks and weeks and weeks after an inspection, and I think it's very difficult for them to justify a position that something is urgent if they've not done something about it. Obviously, each case turns on its own facts, and you have to think about risks, and you have to think about the individual issues that are involved. But if a large period of time has elapsed, then it may be, providing things haven't got worse and provided there's been a trajectory of improvement in the meantime, it may be a lot easier to respond to the enforcement action. For example, the warning notice example that I gave earlier, a client had come to me with some really not great staffing problems, and it had led to a breach of Regulation 18, but between them having the inspection, getting the warning notice, and then the subsequent inspection report that was even further down the line, they'd managed to sort it all out. And again, that's the type of thing that if, for example, that report was published based on the information as at the date of the inspection, that would be a legitimate response as part of factual accuracy comments. Now, the waters get quite muddy here because CQC will say that in terms of inspection reports and not enforcement action, inspection reports are a snapshot as at the date of the inspection. But if they're then using out-of-date information to rely on to issue enforcement action, then that has to be corrected. Otherwise, it's putting incorrect information into the public domain and also having a really negative impact on providers, because mustn't forget that enforcement action can lead to a whole host of problems with commissioners, with funders. You know, if provider groups are trying to expand, it can be really, really tricky. So making sure that you've got a plan in place and communicating all of that, and also communicating, I think it might be something that we come on to talking about, but communicating it to families and staff has to be dealt with really, really carefully, to make sure that you're being transparent, but also managing what could quickly turn into hysteria around some of the enforcement action.
No, thank you. And Tina has come into the comments to say that she's aware of notices of proposal issues before draft inspection reports have been received as well.
Yeah, and that, again, and it shouldn't happen like that. And it's to be honest, it's poor practice, and it's very difficult from a legal perspective, because as a provider you should know the full case against you, as it were, and a lot of that is going to be contained within the inspection report. And if you haven't had the inspection report but you've got a notice of proposal, you know, it's not very joined up and not very helpful. But you know, sometimes these procedural errors can be used to a provider's advantage in terms of the responses and the timelines, and that's something that I would look at holistically as part of, there's so many factors in responding to enforcement action, and that's one of the things that we would be thinking about.
No, thank you. Paula has commented as well, good point from Laura, if you get advice from a lawyer, make sure it is a specialist. There are, obviously, we all know in social care, a number of cowboys out there, so do make sure you do your homework, reach out to Laura directly. So we've got enforcement action. You spoke earlier around to make sure you've got a plan in place. What steps should a provider take once they know that they've got enforcement action, and who should be involved in that in terms of that organisation?
Well, they need to get their team on the ground in place to work out how they're going to respond to it, who's going to take the lead on that, and that will feed into people that were there at the time of the inspection. It should be people at provider level, but also managers on the ground. And I would also say take advice at a really early stage if you can. Whether it's me or whether it's another lawyer, make sure you engage them early on in the process, because quite often, particularly with notices of proposal and notices of decision, they're quite lengthy, they've got lots of allegations, there's lots to get through. To prepare a good case, we're going to want to get lots of evidence, do a really forensic review of everything, and obviously the more time we've got, the easier that is, and the less stressful it is actually for you as a provider, because we do rely a lot on, we rely on you to provide us with the evidence to support what we're saying, and we really appreciate that that's being done at the same time as trying to run a care business and trying to run a care business that's no doubt, you know, say in crisis if they've got enforcement action. They'll be trying to deal with that, they'll be trying to deal with families, commissioners, and you can guarantee that if CQC have concerns, then if you've got local authority funders, they probably have concerns. They may start, if they haven't already, to start their own quality monitoring. And I think it's, again, important not to panic and take a step back and think about it in a stage-by-stage basis. A good lawyer will help take the burden away in terms of being able to prepare the responses with your input so that you can concentrate on the improvements that need to be made and evidencing that and liaising with your family and stakeholders. But again, I would say you may want to consider an independent pair of eyes or an independent pair of hands from a specialist care consultancy, just to try and help steady the ship through the enforcement proceedings. And we've worked with a number of different consultancies, and we work hand in hand with them and tend to get the best results, I would say, when there's a sort of almost multi-agency approach to the response.
Yeah, and I guess that fresh pair of eyes is really important, actually, because I think sometimes when you're in the business every day, you don't realise actually really what's going on because it's just business as usual. And I think anybody that looking for maybe a consultant, there's definitely a couple in there watching live tonight that have been in the comments. So consultants, please feel free to share your details. In terms of, there will be people writing down your name now, Laura, thinking, oh, I should definitely contact them. Where can people find you whilst it's kind of...
Where can you find me? Probably work-wise, social media-wise, probably most active on LinkedIn, and I can share details with everyone after that. You can contact me at HCR Law as well. My details are all on the website. My email address is there. I'm very happy to speak to providers, consultants. I actually find it really beneficial to hear information about how people are finding the single assessment framework, even the good news stories, because they're not usually the ones that will convert into an instruction for me, so that I have a broad picture of how things are operating. I'm particularly interested in the portal, etc. But yeah, HCR Law's website, LinkedIn. I would say follow me on LinkedIn if you want to even just keep up to date, because I do. Thanks very much for sharing the link there to the website. I do try to keep providers up to date. We've also got an HCR landing page for health and social care, where the wider health and social care team try to keep everyone as up to date as possible on updates. And we also run our own suite of webinars and training sessions, and all of that would be advertised on our website. And there's details there about how to subscribe to our mailing list as well.
Lots there for people to take away. Thank you. So we spoke earlier around action plans, and I know action plans and improvement plans are something that trick registered managers a lot of the time, just because they don't know, not necessarily how to create one, but I think there's a confusion of how much detail there should be included, what they should include, and how to kind of implement and monitor that, especially if you've not had enforcement action before, or you've not had any kind of room for improvement. Maybe it's your first time as a manager. What tips do you have for how to set up an action plan? What should be included, and how often should you be reviewing it?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I see such a wide variety, and everybody does it a different way. And I think there's undoubtedly consultants watching who are in a position to give more practical information than I am on it. But what I would definitely say is, from an enforcement setting, make sure, and this sounds really straightforward, but sometimes you wouldn't believe some of the things that get missed. Make sure you're actually targeting the issues that CQC are concerned about, and the breaches. Look at the report, just don't base it off the feedback that CQC have given you. So make it specific to what CQC's concerns are. Don't overcomplicate it, because again, I've seen ones on multiple Excel tabs with different color codes and different dates, and 9 times out of 10, they're actually not properly kept up to date, and it becomes very confusing, and it can make CQC think that the governance isn't particularly great. The next issue, there's 2 things. If you implement an action plan, make sure that it is being reviewed and updated, and that you have clear timelines for when you expect things to be reviewed, but then when they have been reviewed. But there should also be some way of evidencing sustainability of that change. It's quite, I guess what I'm saying with that is, don't just treat it like a tick box exercise. Once one thing's done, you will have to go back and make sure it's continuing to be done. There's very few things that I can think of that are a standalone. Perhaps premises issues, maybe repairing something's a standalone issue. But in terms of things like medication management audits, you've put a new policy in place, but is it being adhered to? Are you doing competencies? And make sure people have ownership of the action plan, and make sure that's clear.
No, definitely. You definitely need to communicate it. And I think it's like any action plan that you might have. Actually, you need to make sure people have got the resources, the time. And I can imagine that actually becomes a really stressful time within that service when you've got enforcement action to try and make sure that changes are made, especially if there's kind of a time frame on them. Tina has recommended read each line of the inspection report, and feedback is so important. And she's recommended for years now a RAG-B improvement plan. I don't know if the B is meant to be on the end or not, but definitely a RAG improvement plan. So in terms of, you spoke earlier around reports and giving CQC those insights. How important is it to follow up? So obviously, as corrective actions being made, should providers be notifying the CQC? Should they be writing more reports? Kind of what's best practice there of notifying them of any updates?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's anything sort of specific in terms of best practice. Obviously, the portal was heralded as this tool that providers could use to give real-time feedback, and the single assessment framework was really sort of heralded as that generally real-time regulation. Everything was going to be really up to date, etc., etc. And it hasn't played out that way. And at the moment, particularly in circumstances where providers have no idea, to be quite honest, of when CQC will be back, when they'll be re-rated, when they'll be reassessed, providers have to be proactive and provide that improvement. Now, obviously, there's more of an incentive to do that, where if you've got a warning notice and you need to demonstrate compliance. And following up on what I said earlier, you normally get a date to be compliant, but it's very rare in my experience to see CQC actually come back out and re-inspect. If I was a provider, I would be saying, this is the date, we've complied, this is the evidence, please can we have some feedback on this? I suspect you won't get it, but at least you'll have a record and an audit trail for when you come to be inspected. And even more generally, just in terms of inspections and waiting for reports and reassessments and re-ratings, it's very difficult, and it depends on where you are, how long it is between the inspection and the report coming out. And as I've said, you want to make sure you can influence that. But then once the report comes out, you don't know when they're going to be back again. If they are going to follow up on real-time regulation and looking at the priorities that they've suggested in their survey, for example, data about outstanding practice, it should trigger a re-inspection, hopefully. So if you can proactively supply that to CQC, because I still think it's very unclear in terms of CQC's data model and where they're getting all the data from. It's very clear to me to see where negative data comes from, safeguardings, coroner's reports, all the things we've talked about, negative feedback, but I'm not entirely clear where they will be getting their evidence bank of good practice and outstanding. So providers should use that opportunity, and they should proactively supply it to CQC, and it's an example of good governance.
No, absolutely. I think one thing Adam and I have spoken about in the past is making sure that you send, and obviously we don't have named inspectors anymore, but actually making sure you email through, obviously not anything that's got personal data and bits and pieces, but through to their main inquiries inbox, because actually it will link that to your account, but so that you're feeding the CQC those positive messages, the positive impact you've had, the difference that you make into people's lives. So actually they've got that regular stream of communication. But you are right, I can definitely see where the negative side comes from, but not so much those providers that are stable, that are delivering good or high quality care, where they kind of sit at the moment in that framework of re-inspection process.
Yeah, it is tricky, and hopefully it will all come together. But at the moment, it's a really difficult time for providers, and it's a real no man's land. And so I think providers have to be proactive and do everything they can to protect and promote their own service, and work within the information that we've got until we have better information about re-inspections and the portal and whatnot.
No, absolutely. So in an ideal world, improvements are made, things are going back, services kind of ticking along as it should be. What strategies do you recommend to prevent kind of future enforcement action? And is that generally what you see? Do you see actually a provider has enforcement action, they make changes, and then they kind of, or is it actually that they fall foul again and again and again, or is it?
It depends. There's a real mixture, and it's tricky because there's so many things that feed into it. Staffing is one, and staffing is difficult, especially registered managers, etc. at the moment. But continuous improvement, and I guess it's a buzzword at CQC, embedding and sustaining change, because where providers will come unstuck and find themselves in multiple enforcement scenarios is where, yeah, they may do enough in their action plan to satisfy CQC that they should withdraw the notice of proposal or, a good inspection report. But if they can't maintain that change, and there are repeated breaches of the regulations, that's where they can see themselves in hot water. And the more often it happens, the more difficult it becomes to defend, because you then have that regulatory history. So I would say really good strategies for embedding and sustaining change, and that may be in a situation where you can perhaps recruit a registered manager or retain a stable management team for whatever reason. That may be the time when you want to think about having some external support to make sure that the changes that you've made have really embedded themselves in the whole culture of the organisation, and that's, you know, from the top to the bottom, and that's really what's going to stop the enforcement action, or it's going to minimise the risk. I mean, in a care setting, you can never eradicate all risk, and it's all about minimising risk. But, you know, in terms of good governance and making sure you're not exposed to enforcement action, embedding and sustaining change, and being committed to continuous improvement and measuring yourself against the quality statements, getting your feedback, acting on it, producing the case studies, evidencing the good outcomes.
No, thank you. And on the flip side of that question I've just asked, there will be providers watching either live or on catch up that are going through enforcement action at the moment. What support and resources and tools are available for those that are looking for support? Obviously, they can reach out to you. Is there anything else on the internet?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I would say always try and take advice. Again, it doesn't have to be from myself, from whoever, but make sure they're specialists in what they do. It's almost never too late to engage someone. And, you know, we have been instructed right up to the, you know, the very last minute before a tribunal, even in the middle of tribunals where people have been represented. So it's never too late. But there are also a number of resources on CQC's own website. You know, familiarise yourself with their own enforcement policy, which is published. It was updated relatively recently this year. That's some of the best information, but also look back at the regulations as well, because again, and we started, and maybe it's a good way to end, you know, the discussion that we're having. The law and the regulations have not changed as a result of the single assessment framework. And what I have seen throughout the years is sometimes CQC can conflate their own guidance with what's actually in the regulations, and, you know, what might not meet their guidance might not actually be a breach of the regulations. And for me, one of the key processes to responding to enforcement action is thinking about the case to answer. And yeah, X, Y, and Z might have happened, but does that amount to a breach of a regulation? And is it proportionate enough for enforcement action? So yeah, taking it back to basics, Health and Social Care Act and the Regulated Activities Regulations, which should be your Bible. And if you're in enforcement action, obviously the enforcement policy. And CQC does, with the notice, you'll get information about responding, they'll send forms, etc. So if you're not in a position to engage legal support externally, then, you know, there are resources. But we also produce a number of articles which are on our website, which would give you a bit of a steer as well. And again, on the social channels that I've mentioned. But if you can, I mean, enforcement action is high stakes, and we've talked to, and depending on what level, it can be very, very high stakes. It can be the difference between the service being cancelled or not. And so I would say that in those circumstances, if you're able to make the investment for really good legal advice, then, you know, it's going to pay dividends. But it's not a sales pitch. Just it's something that you have to take seriously, because everyone around you will take it seriously. Your commissioners, your family members, you know, your funders, lenders, etc. So getting it responded to quickly and ideally getting it right the first time is the best way to do it.
No, thank you very much, Laura. I'm very conscious of time and letting you get back to your evening. I am very thankful for you giving up your Tuesday evening to join us. I've made loads of notes because actually I think it's really informative. And I know that there's a whole suite of articles on your website that I'll make sure that I share out after today's show, because actually they're really insightful as well onto kind of CQC and from the perspective of a law firm as opposed to somebody working kind of frontline in social care. I definitely found them kind of informative and insightful. So
great, it's been lovely to be here. There's an article gone out, I'll share it with you today. I think it's just gone on the website today about preparing for inspection, so it probably just delves in a bit more detail into what we've spoken about. But thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for sharing my channels. And if there's anyone watching live or watching back that does have any questions, please do feel free to reach out to me or the team, even just for an informal chat to begin with.
No, thank you very much. And before we end tonight's show, just to shout out to our sponsors again. So we've got Prosperwell Digital Marketing Agency, we've got Care Business Associate Training, and Attis Care by Attis Insurance Brokers. I'll pop Laura's details there on the HCR Law website. But like Laura said earlier, you can find her on LinkedIn. If anybody does struggle, please reach out to us on the Care Review and we can network you in. Laura, thank you again for joining me this evening.
No worries, thanks so much.